At first, it seemed like a small inconvenience, a missing letter here, a late bill there. I had assumed it was just the usual postal delays, nothing to be too concerned about. Mail gets lost sometimes, right? The thought of someone intentionally messing with it never even crossed my mind. But then, things started to get strange. It began with my bank statements going missing. At first, I chalked it up to a mix-up and requested another copy. But when the replacement never arrived either, I knew something was off. Then my utility bill showed up late, barely arriving before the due date. And then, one day, I received an email from my insurance provider saying that my policy update letter had been returned as undeliverable. That's when I started to pay attention. Was it just me? Or were other people in the neighborhood experiencing the same thing? The neighborhood realizes something is wrong. I casually brought it up while talking to my neighbor, Mr. Harris, a retired veteran who had lived in the community for over 20 years. He was the kind of guy who kept up with everything, so if there was something strange going on, I figured he'd know. As we exchanged pleasantries, he sighed and mentioned, "I think my mail's going missing. I was supposed to receive a VA benefits letter 2 weeks ago, and it never showed up." That sent alarm bells ringing. I told him about my own missing mail, and his face darkened. "That's not a coincidence," he muttered. "Something's going on." Now I was really suspicious. So over the next few days, I casually asked other neighbors if they had noticed anything unusual with their mail. Some shrugged it off, but a handful admitted that their letters had been delayed or had gone missing entirely. Mrs. Thompson, a sweet elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, frowned as she thought back. And now that you mention it, I never got my Social Security check last month. I had to request a replacement. I thought it was just a mistake, but now, and that's when it clicked. This wasn't bad luck. Someone was tampering with the mail. The suspicious figure near the mailboxes. Now that I knew something was wrong, I started keeping an eye out. And then one morning, I saw it with my own eyes. I was sipping coffee on my front porch, enjoying the fresh morning air, when I noticed a woman standing near my mailbox. She wasn't the mail carrier. She was dressed in a blazer and slacks, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose. She looked official, like some kind of inspector. But something about her felt wrong. And then it hit me. It was Karen. Joy Karen. The self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood, the woman who complained about everything, the same person who had been harassing people for years over the most ridiculous HOA violations. But what was she doing at my mailbox? Catching Karen in the act. I watched as she opened my mailbox, reached inside, and pulled out my mail. I almost spilled my coffee. She flipped through the envelopes, pausing at one in particular. She stared at it for a long moment, then, to my absolute shock, she tore it in half, stuffed the pieces in her pocket, and walked away. She had just stolen and destroyed my mail. And suddenly, everything made sense. The missing bills, the delayed letters, the important documents that never arrived. Karen had been intercepting people's mail. But why? Was she just a control freak? Was she spying on us? Or was she deliberately targeting certain homeowners? I had to find out, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The pattern becomes clear. Now that I had seen Karen interfering with my mail firsthand, I was determined to track her movements. I spent the next few mornings watching carefully. And sure enough, Karen had a routine. She would wait until the mail carrier had done their rounds, then she'd casually walk down the street, pretending to be on a neighborhood inspection. But in reality, she was checking people's mailboxes. Sometimes she would just peek inside, scanning through envelopes. Other times, she would take certain letters and walk away with them. And worst of all, she wasn't just doing this to me. I saw her do it to Mr. Harris. I saw her stop at Mrs. Thompson's mailbox, flip through her letters, and shove one into her purse. Karen was actively stealing and tampering with people's mail. And that was a federal crime. The plan to catch her red-handed. It wasn't enough to just see it happening. I needed proof, so I decided to set a trap. I installed a hidden camera near my mailbox, carefully positioning it so it would capture Karen's movements without being obvious. Then I waited. And within 2 days, I had my evidence. The footage was clear as day. Karen, walking up to my mailbox, flipping through my mail, taking an envelope, and walking away. I watched the clip 3 times just to be sure. And then I smiled. Because now, Now I had her, and Karen was about to find out that she had messed with the wrong person. Now that I had proof, video evidence of Karen snooping through my mailbox and taking my mail, it was time to dig deeper. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen wasn't just stealing my letters. She was systematically targeting certain homeowners in the neighborhood. And I needed to know why. Watching Karen's routine, the web of intrusion. For the next week, I dedicated myself to tracking Karen's movements. Every morning, she would wait until the mail carrier had finished their rounds. Then, under the guise of taking a walk or conducting an HOA inspection, she would stroll down the street, peering into people's mailboxes. Sometimes, she would just scan through the envelopes, shaking her head as if making mental notes. Other times, she would pull out specific letters, read them, and either put them back or take them with her. But there was a pattern. She wasn't checking every mailbox. She was targeting specific houses. And they weren't random. The list of targets, well, what do they have in common? I went back through the footage I had recorded and made a list of every house she tampered with. My house, Mr. Harris, the retired veteran. Mrs. Thompson, elderly woman on Social Security. The new couple who had just moved in 2 months ago. The single mom who had been struggling with late HOA payments. That's when it clicked. She was going after people who she thought were problematic. It wasn't just random theft. Karen was spying on people's finances. She was looking for overdue bills, late notices, financial struggles, anything that she could use as leverage to make people's lives hell. The HOA's involvement, a possible conspiracy? That realization made me even angrier. Because suddenly, this wasn't just one crazy Karen acting on her own. Was the HOA involved? Were they targeting specific homeowners to intimidate them, hit them with fines, or force them out? The thought made my skin crawl. Because I knew how HOAs operated. They liked clean neighborhoods. They hated homeowners who pushed back against their ridiculous rules. They especially didn't like people who questioned where their HOA fees were going. And the people Karen was targeting, they were all people who had spoken out against the HOA before. Was this part of a bigger scheme? The confrontation, I catch Karen red-handed. With my evidence ready, I knew it was time to confront Karen directly. But I wasn't just going to talk to her. I was going to catch her in the act, in real time, and put an end to it once and for all. So the next morning, I set up a sting operation. I placed a dummy letter inside my mailbox, a fake overdue bill notice with my name on it, printed to look as real as possible. Then I set up my phone camera, hit record, and waited. Sure enough, Karen showed up. I watched from my kitchen window as she casually strolled toward my mailbox, looked around to see if anyone was watching, and pulled out the envelope. She squinted at it, her lips curling into a smirk. Then she pulled out her phone, took a picture of the letter, and put it back inside the mailbox. And that's when I stepped outside. Hey, Karen, what the hell do you think you're doing? She flinched so hard she nearly dropped her phone. For a split second, her face went pale. But then, as always, she recovered quickly, switching to her usual smug expression. Oh, good morning. I was just checking to make sure everything is in order with the mailboxes. You know, part of my HOA responsibilities. I laughed out loud. Your HOA responsibilities? Since when does the HOA have anything to do with people's personal mail? Karen tilted her head, still trying to act innocent. Oh, we just like to ensure that mail isn't being misdelivered. Some of the residents are elderly, and we wouldn't want them to miss important documents. I held up my phone. You mean like how you just took a picture of my mail? That's funny, Karen, because I don't remember giving you permission to read my private letters. Her smirk vanished. Her eyes darted to my phone, and I could see the panic starting to settle in. Karen tries to lie her way out. Oh, that was just part of my inspection. I was making sure that. Karen, stop. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You've been stealing people's mail. I have it all on video. She froze. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face twitching as she processed what I had just said. Then she did what every guilty person does when they get caught. She got angry. You have no right to record me. That's illegal. I could sue you for harassment. I roll my eyes. You're the one stealing mail, Karen. Pretty sure that's a felony. Her face turned red. She took a deep breath, as if trying to calm herself, and then said, Listen, I'm only doing this for the good of the community. There are rules. We can't have people neglecting their responsibilities, and sometimes the HOA has to step in. I raised an eyebrow. By stealing people's bank statements? She clenched her fists. Some people don't deserve to live here if they can't follow the rules. And there it was. The truth. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a gatekeeper. A self-righteous HOA tyrant who thought she had the right to decide who belonged in the neighborhood. The next steps, reporting Karen to the authorities. I wasn't going to waste any more time arguing with her. I had all the proof I needed. Video evidence of her taking mail. Pictures of her snooping in mailboxes. Statements from multiple neighbors who had missing mail. This wasn't just an HOA issue anymore. This was a federal crime, and I was about to make sure Karen paid for it. So I smiled, stepped back, and said, "Hope you enjoy your day, Karen. Because I have a meeting with the postmaster and the police in about an hour." Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened, then closed. Then she turned and stormed away, practically running back to her house. But it was too late, because the moment she walked away, I hit send. And just like that, Karen's reign of mailbox terror was about to come crashing down. Karen had spent weeks, maybe even months, illegally tampering with mail, spying on people's personal correspondence, and deciding for herself who deserved to live in the neighborhood. Now, it was time for her to face the consequences, and I was going to make sure she didn't get away with it. Reporting Karen to the authorities. As soon as Karen stormed off in a panic, I went inside, sat at my desk, and compiled all the evidence I had gathered over the past week. Multiple videos of Karen going through mailboxes. Footage of her taking specific letters and stuffing them in her purse. Screenshots of her photographing my fake overdue bill. A list of neighbors who had reported missing mail. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was mail fraud. And mail fraud? That's a federal offense. So I made 2 calls. First, to the local police department. Second, to the postmaster's office at the United States Postal Inspection Service, USPS. Because if Karen thought a little HOA power trip would protect her from real consequences, she was in for a rude awakening. The postmaster takes it seriously. By the next morning, I got a call back from the local postmaster. He was not happy about what I had reported. "Tampering with mail is a serious crime," he said, his voice tight with anger. "If what you're saying is true, she could be facing real charges." I told him I had video evidence, and within 2 hours, he was at my house, sitting in my living room, reviewing the footage. The moment he saw Karen digging through my mailbox, pulling out letters and stuffing them into her purse, his expression darkened. "This is blatant mail theft," he muttered, pausing the video. "And it looks like she's been doing this to multiple residents?" I nodded. "I have statements from at least 5 people who've had missing or delayed mail." The postmaster let out a low whistle. "That's enough for us to open a formal investigation." I couldn't help but grin. "So what happens next?" I asked. He leaned forward. "We'll notify the authorities, and if she's been taking federal mail, she could be looking at real criminal charges." I nodded. "Good. Because she's been getting away with this for too long. The police get involved." Later that day, I got a call from Officer Daniels, the same cop who had responded to Karen's previous petty HOA complaints against me. "You again," he joked. "What did Karen do this time?" I explained the situation, and this time his tone got serious. "Tampering with mail? That's not just a slap on the wrist kind of crime. If she's caught, she could be facing up to 5 years in federal prison." I grinned. "Perfect. When can we get this moving?" "We'll send an officer by tomorrow to take an official report," he said. "And once the Postal Service files their case, she won't be able to weasel her way out of this." Karen's HO allies try to intervene. The next morning, just as I was about to leave for work, I noticed 2 people standing on my porch. One of them was Greg Thompson, the HOA president. The other, Karen. She was wearing her best fake innocent face, but I could see the panic in her eyes. Greg cleared his throat. "Can we talk?" I crossed my arms. "About what?" He forced a smile. "We heard you've been making some allegations." Karen jumped in. "There's no need to take this to the authorities. This is just a simple misunderstanding." I raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding? I have you on video committing a federal crime." Karen's face turned red. Greg sighed. Look, we don't need to escalate this into a legal issue. Maybe we can come to a mutual agreement. I let out a sharp laugh. Oh, I see. The HOA suddenly cares about fairness now that one of their own is in trouble. Greg frowned. We're just trying to keep the peace. I shook my head. No, you're trying to cover for her. And I'm not interested. Karen stepped forward. I was just trying to make sure people were following HOA guidelines. Some people were receiving past due notices for their HOA fees, and I needed to verify if I cut her off. HOA rules don't give you the right to steal mail, Karen. She flinched. I took out my phone, holding up the official email from the postmaster confirming their investigation had been launched. This is out of your hands now. You messed with the wrong person. Karen's breathing got shallow. Please. I didn't mean. I stepped inside and shut the door in their faces. Karen's arrest, the moment of truth. 2 days later, I was mowing my lawn when I saw a black SUV pull up in front of Karen's house. It wasn't the police. It was the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. 2 agents in suits stepped out, walked up to her door, and knocked. A few moments later, Karen appeared, still in her morning robe, clutching a coffee cup. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw her face go pale. Then, one of the agents handed her a piece of paper. Her hand started shaking. She tried to argue, waving her arms, but the agents weren't having it. And then, just like that, they cuffed her. Right there, in broad daylight, in front of the entire neighborhood. I saw neighbors peeking out their windows, whispering, recording. And as they led Karen toward the car, she suddenly looked over at me. Her face twisted in pure hatred. I just smiled and waved. Because justice had finally been served. Karen's consequences. Karen was officially charged with mail tampering, which carried a hefty fine and possible jail time. But that wasn't even the best part. The HOA, which had tried to cover for her, was now facing legal action from multiple residents for allowing Karen to violate their privacy and tamper with personal documents. They tried to distance themselves from her, claiming she had acted alone. But once word got out that the HOA had been protecting her, homeowners started demanding a full board review. And soon after, Greg Thompson was forced to resign. The aftermath, a Karen-free neighborhood. With Karen gone and the HOA in shambles, the neighborhood finally felt peaceful again. People who had once been too scared to speak out now felt safe to push back against the HOA's ridiculous rules. Neighbors actually started talking to each other again, instead of living in fear of Karen's nosy inspections. And me? I finally got to enjoy checking my mail without wondering if some power-hungry HOA tyrant was reading it first. Because Karen? She was just a bad memory now. And the best part? She was never coming back. Karen's arrest for mail tampering had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to speak out against the HOA's corruption. At first, I thought this was the end of it. Karen was gone, and I could finally live in peace. But then, just when I thought the nightmare was over, it decided to dig itself into an even deeper hole. The HOA's emergency meeting, a desperate attempt at damage control. 3 days after Karen was hauled away in cuffs, I received an official-looking letter from the HOA, inviting all residents to an emergency community meeting. The subject? Addressing misunderstandings regarding recent events. I almost laughed out loud. I knew exactly what this was about. Karen had been one of their own, an HOA enforcer, a rule pusher, their loudest advocate for community standards. And now that she had been exposed as a criminal, they were scrambling to protect their own reputation. So I decided to attend the meeting just to see how badly they were going to embarrass themselves. And let me tell you, they did not disappoint. The meeting, HOA Lies and Desperation. The HOA had rented out the local clubhouse for the meeting, and when I arrived, the room was packed. People who had never attended a meeting before were now sitting in the audience, arms crossed, waiting for answers. At the front of the room, standing at a podium, was Greg Thompson, the HOA president. He looked visibly uncomfortable. Karen was nowhere to be seen, of course. She was too busy dealing with her legal problems. Greg cleared his throat and started speaking. As many of you know, there have been some recent developments regarding a former HOA member. We understand that misinformation has been spreading, and we want to set the record straight. Misinformation? I nearly laughed. There was video evidence of Karen committing a federal crime, and this guy was still trying to spin it. Greg continued. While we acknowledge that mistakes were made, we want to emphasize that Karen's actions were taken with the best interest of the community in mind. That's when the room erupted. The best interest of the community? One woman shouted. She was stealing our mail. Another man stood up. You knew about this, didn't you? Greg held up his hands defensively. Now, let's keep things civil. Civil? You let a criminal run the and you're still trying to defend her. People were furious. They weren't buying Greg's excuses. And that's when I decided to speak up. Exposing the HO's lies. My turn to speak. I stood up, and the entire room went quiet. Greg swallowed hard as I walked toward the front. Greg, I said calmly, how long did it go and know Karen was tampering with mail? He shifted uncomfortably. We were not aware of any misconduct. Well, I have security footage that proves otherwise. His face twitched. I pulled out my phone, opened the video, and played it for everyone to see. The entire room watched in horrified silence as Karen was caught on camera, snooping through mailboxes, taking letters, and photographing personal documents. When the video ended, I looked Greg dead in the eyes. And you're telling me the HOA had no idea this was happening? Greg opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, someone in the audience yelled, "Liar." Another woman stood up. You guys let her do this. Admit it. People started shouting, demanding answers. Greg looked like he was about to have a stroke. Then, the final nail in the coffin. A new voice spoke up from the back of the room. I used to be on the HOA board, and I can confirm that Greg knew what Karen was doing. A whistleblower exposes everything. The entire room turned to look at the man who had spoken. It was David Simmons, a former HOA board member who had mysteriously resigned a year ago. Greg's face went pale. David, don't. No, Greg, David interrupted. It's time the truth came out. He walked to the front of the room and faced the crowd. I quit the HOA because of corruption. And one of the biggest issues was Karen's abuse of power. People murmured in shock. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor, David continued. She had access to HOA records, financial reports, delinquent payments, homeowner complaints. And she used that access to target people she didn't like. I clenched my jaw. Are you saying the HOA gave her this information? I asked. David nodded grimly. They didn't just give it to her. They encouraged her to use it against homeowners they considered problems. The room exploded. People started yelling, demanding answers. You mean the HOA let her go through our private mail? Is this why some of us kept getting random fines? How long has this been going on? Greg tried to calm people down, but it was too late. The truth was out, and the HOA was crumbling in real time. The HOA faces a revolt. By the end of the meeting, residents were furious. People demanded an independent audit of the HOA's finances. Some were talking about a lawsuit for breach of privacy. A petition was started to remove the entire HOA board. Greg, sweating and stammering, tried to calm things down, but he was drowned out by angry voices. And just like that, the HOA had lost control. The final blow, the HOA board resigns. Within a month, the HOA was in complete chaos. Facing multiple legal threats, a neighborhood-wide revolt, and a financial audit, Greg Thompson and the rest of the board resigned in disgrace. Karen? She was still dealing with her own legal mess. And as for the HOA, it was dismantled entirely. The neighborhood voted to dissolve it, freeing homeowners from years of corruption and harassment. And just like that, Karen and her entire power structure were gone. The neighborhood after Karen, a fresh start. With no more HOA rules hanging over our heads, life in the neighborhood actually became enjoyable. People started talking to each other again. No more random fines or power-hungry HOA goons. No more Karen lording over everyone like a queen. For the first time in years, our community felt like a neighborhood again. And me? I could finally check my mail in peace. Because Karen? She was just a bad memory. A reminder that when people stand up against corruption, the right people will always win. Karen's downfall had been swift and brutal. Her illegal activities had been exposed. She had been arrested in broad daylight, and the HO, her biggest shield of protection, had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. But while the neighborhood was celebrating its newfound freedom, Karen was still dealing with the consequences of her actions. And trust me, they were severe. Karen's criminal charges, the federal investigation. The moment the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, USPS, got involved, Karen's situation went from bad to worse. Because tampering with mail, that wasn't just a petty crime. It was a felony. After the investigation wrapped up, Karen was officially charged with multiple counts of mail tampering and mail fraud. The potential penalties? A federal fine of up to $250,000. Up to 5 years in prison. Mandatory restitution to the people she stole from. She tried to plead ignorance, saying she was just monitoring the mailboxes for the good of the neighborhood. The judge didn't buy it, especially after the prosecutors played the security footage in court, showing her going through mailboxes, stealing letters, and taking photos of personal information. The moment they played the clip of her ripping up one of my bank statements, the courtroom fell silent. And Karen, she visibly shrank in her chair. Her lawyer tried to argue for leniency, saying she was just a misguided woman trying to enforce community rules. But the judge wasn't having it. He looked Karen straight in the eye and said, "You abused your position in the community. You violated people's privacy, and you have shown zero remorse for your actions. You didn't just break the law, you broke the trust of your neighbors. This court finds you guilty of multiple counts of mail tampering and fraud." And with that, Karen was convicted. She wasn't sentenced to prison, but she was hit with a $50,000 fine, a permanent federal record, 200 hours of community service, a formal restraining order preventing her from interacting with any of her former neighbors. She also had to compensate every homeowner she stole from. That included me, Mr. Harris, Mrs. Thompson, and half a dozen others. And let me tell you, watching Karen write me a check for all the stress she caused, that was worth more than any prison sentence. Karen becomes a social pariah. Even after her sentencing, Karen's life continued to fall apart. Word spread fast about what she had done, and suddenly, no one wanted anything to do with her. She became a pariah. Friends stopped returning her calls. Former HOA members distanced themselves from her. Local businesses refused to serve her. She had spent years acting like she was untouchable, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Now, she was an outcast, and it drove her insane. Karen tries to save herself and fails miserably. After her conviction, Karen tried everything she could to salvage her reputation. She started posting on community Facebook groups, claiming she was the real victim. She even tried to blame the HOA, saying that they had forced her to monitor people's mail. But nobody believed her. Every time she tried to defend herself, someone would link the court records proving she had been convicted of mail fraud. People laughed at her excuses. Her name became a joke. And eventually, she stopped posting altogether. Karen's final humiliation, forced to move away. With her reputation destroyed, her bank account drained from legal fees, and a restraining order preventing her from interacting with her neighbors, Karen had only one option left. She put her house up for sale. The moment I saw the for sale sign go up, I knew Karen was officially done. But the best part? Nobody wanted to buy her house. Because when potential buyers researched the neighborhood, they kept finding articles and community posts about what Karen had done. No one wanted to live in the house of a convicted criminal. She had spent years bullying others, acting like she was above the rules. Now, the market rejected her, and eventually she had to sell her house at a massive loss. The final insult. The person who bought Karen's house? A single mom, the same woman Karen had tried to force out for being a bad fit for the neighborhood. It was poetic justice. And when moving day finally came, I made sure to watch from my porch as Karen packed up the last of her things. As she walked toward her car, our eyes met one last time. I raised my coffee mug in a mock toast. "Safe travels, Karen." She glared at me, her face twisted in rage. And then she sped off, never to be seen again. The neighborhood after Karen, a new beginning. With Karen gone, life in the neighborhood became 100 times better. No more ridiculous LA fines. No more stolen mail. No more power-hungry Karens trying to control everyone. People started coming together, actually talking to each other instead of living in fear of HOA harassment. The single mom who moved into Karen's house? She hosted a block party within her first month. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my home in peace. No more looking over my shoulder. No more fighting against corrupt HOA politics. Just me, my house, and a future free from Karen's insanity. And every time I checked my mailbox, I smiled. Because now, I knew my mail was safe. Karen was gone. The HOA had collapsed. The neighborhood had reclaimed its freedom, and justice had been served in full. But for me, this wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about ensuring that another Karen could never rise again. Because while one villain had been defeated, I knew that if we didn't take the right steps, another power-hungry, self-righteous tyrant could try to take her place. And I wasn't going to let that happen. Making sure the Ito stayed dead. One of the first things I did after Karen disappeared for good was work with my neighbors to ensure that no new HOA could ever rise again. You see, even though the previous HOA board had resigned in disgrace, that didn't mean another one couldn't form in the future. All it would take was a few overly ambitious homeowners, a slick sales pitch about protecting property values, and before you knew it, we'd have another Karen running around, issuing fines for the color of our front doors. So we decided to take action. A group of us came together, myself, Mr. Harris, the single mom who had moved into Karen's house, and a few other longtime residents, and we worked with a lawyer to draft a legal agreement. The result? We passed a neighborhood-wide vote to permanently dissolve any possibility of a new HOA being formed. We registered the decision with the county, making it legally binding. We made sure that any attempt to reinstate an HOA would require a unanimous vote from every homeowner, something that would never happen. In short, we proofed the neighborhood forever. And let me tell you, the moment we got that finalized legal document, I slept better than I had in years, helping other neighborhoods fight back. After word spread about how we had taken down Karen and the corrupt HOA, something unexpected happened. People from other neighborhoods started reaching out to me. Homeowners who were being harassed by their own HOAs. People who had been fined for ridiculous things. Folks who were terrified to speak up, afraid of retaliation. And you know what? I wasn't just going to sit back and let it happen to them. So I decided to use my experience to help others. I started an online community where people could share their HOA horror stories, get legal advice on how to fight back, learn how to dismantle corrupt HOA boards in their own neighborhoods. I even wrote a detailed guide on how we had destroyed our HOA, step by step. And within 6 months, I started hearing from people who had successfully removed their own HOA boards. All thanks to what we had done here. Karen's downfall. It wasn't just a win for us. It was a blueprint for fighting back against HOA tyranny everywhere. Karen tries to make a comeback and fails miserably. Just when I thought I had heard the last of Karen, something hilarious happened. One day, I got an anonymous email. The subject? Guess who's trying to join another HOA? I clicked the message, and there it was. A screenshot of Karen standing in front of a HOA community meeting in another neighborhood, pitching herself as a board candidate. I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. Karen, who had been exposed as a criminal, fined $50,000 and forced to sell her home at a loss, was trying to worm her way into power again. But here's the best part. The people in that neighborhood, they already knew about her history. Before she even had a chance to campaign, they started posting links to news articles about her arrest. They shared court records. They blasted her all over social media. Within 48 hours, Karen's attempt to seize power in a new neighborhood was completely shut down. She disappeared from the community meeting and never tried again. It was the ultimate humiliation. And honestly, it was perfect. Because no matter where she went, she would never escape her own past. The internet never forgets. And Karen, she was now a walking cautionary tale. The neighborhood's final victory. With the HOA permanently dead, the fear of fines and Karen's reign of terror officially over, our neighborhood transformed into something amazing. People started actually getting to know their neighbors again. We had community barbecues, holiday decorations, and a true sense of togetherness. The fear and paranoia that the HOA had spread for years vanished completely. And the best part? Nobody missed it. For the first time in years, we were truly free. No more random fines. No more Karen lording over us. No more HOA dictatorship. Just homeowners living in peace. And every time I walked past Karen's old house, now filled with laughter and warmth, I smiled. Because I knew she had lost, and we had won. Final reflection, the lesson we learned. Looking back, I realized that Karen's downfall wasn't just about stopping one bad person. It was about standing up against corruption, control, and unnecessary power. Karen thought she had absolute authority. She thought she could bully people into submission. She thought she would never face consequences. But she was wrong. Because when good people stand up, when community fights back, tyrants always fall. So if there's one lesson to take from this, never let a Karen go unchecked. Never let HOA power trippers dictate how you live your life. And if you ever find yourself dealing with someone like Karen, fight back. Because when you do, you'll realize that they were never as powerful as they pretended to be. And you were always stronger than you knew.